The morning sun cast long shadows across the gardens of Windsor Castle as King Charles made his way down the familiar stone path. His daily walk had become more than just exercise. It was his time to think, to process the weight of the crown that still felt heavy on his shoulders even after months of wearing it. As he rounded the corner near the rose garden, he stopped. There, sitting on the old wooden bench beneath the ancient oak tree, was Catherine. She wasn't supposed to be here this early. Usually she would be at Adelaide Cottage, getting the children ready for school, managing the chaos that came with being a mother of 3. But here she was, dressed simply in jeans and a cream sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. She looked up as she heard his footsteps, and Charles was struck by something he had never noticed before. There was a strength in her eyes, a quiet dignity that reminded him of someone he had loved deeply many years ago. "Your Majesty," Catherine said. Starting to stand. "Please don't," Charles said gently, gesturing for her to remain seated. "May I join you?" Catherine nodded, moving slightly to make room on the bench. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both looking out at the garden where daffodils were beginning to push through the earth, promising spring's arrival. "I often came here as a child," Charles said finally. "My grandmother would bring me here when the palace felt too overwhelming. She said gardens teach us patience." Catherine smiled softly. "The children love it here too. George is fascinated by the old trees, always asking how long they've been growing. Charlotte tries to count all the different flowers." There was something about the way she spoke about the children, with such genuine warmth and protection, that made Charles's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't romantic, nothing inappropriate, but rather a deep recognition of shared purpose, shared understanding of what it meant to put duty before personal desires. "You're doing remarkably well," he said, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. "This life, this role we're all thrust into, it's not easy. I remember when Diana—" He paused, rarely speaking her name aloud anymore. Catherine turned to look at him, her green eyes patient and understanding. "She would be proud of William," she said simply. "And proud of you too, I think." The words hit Charles unexpectedly. He had spent years wondering about Diana's opinion, carrying guilt and regret like stones in his pockets. To hear Catherine, who had never met Diana but understood her legacy, speak with such certainty was both comforting and unsettling. "The press is always watching," Charles continued, his voice taking on a protective tone. "They're waiting for any sign of weakness, any crack in the facade. But you handle it with such grace." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, watching a robin hop across the grass. "Someone once told me that grace isn't about being perfect," she said. "It's about being authentic while still serving something bigger than yourself." Charles found himself studying her profile, the way the morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the determined set of her jaw. She was William's wife, his daughter-in-law, but in this moment she felt like something more. An ally, a kindred spirit who understood the impossible balance between personal happiness and public duty. In the distance, they could hear the sound of cars arriving, the beginning of another day of royal obligations. Catherine stood first, smoothing down her sweater. "I should get back," she said. "The children will be wondering where I've gone." Charles remained seated for a moment longer, watching as she walked away with that characteristic poise that never seemed forced or calculated. As she disappeared around the bend in the path, he realized something had shifted in him during their brief conversation. For the first time in months, he hadn't thought about Camilla's increasing absences, her growing distance, her subtle but persistent suggestions that perhaps she needed more time away from royal duties. Instead, he had felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine connection with someone who understood his world without needing explanations or apologies. The morning air felt different as Charles finally stood and continued his walk. The daffodils seemed brighter, the possibilities of spring more promising. He didn't yet understand what was happening, didn't recognize the dangerous territory his thoughts were beginning to explore. All he knew was that Catherine's words about authenticity and service had resonated with something deep inside him, something that had been dormant for far too long. As he walked back toward the castle, he found himself looking forward to their next encounter, though he told himself it was simply the pleasure of meaningful conversation with a fellow member of the family. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, but Charles carried with him the memory of green eyes full of understanding and a voice that spoke of grace without perfection. It was a memory that would prove more powerful and more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. 3 weeks had passed since the morning in the garden, and Charles found himself increasingly aware of the empty spaces in his daily routine. Camilla had always been a constant presence, but lately, her chair at breakfast remained empty more often than not. When he asked about her whereabouts, the staff would politely inform him that the queen consort was attending to personal matters or visiting friends in the countryside. The pattern had started subtly months ago. First, it was missing the occasional state dinner, claiming headaches or fatigue. Then it became skipping morning briefings, leaving Charles to handle royal business alone. Now it seemed she was actively avoiding not just public duties, but him as well. Charles sat in his private study, staring at the latest schedule his secretary had prepared. Another week of engagements, and beside each event, either a note that Camilla would not be attending or a question mark indicating her participation was uncertain. "Your Majesty?" His private secretary James appeared in the doorway. "The Queen Consort has called to say she won't be returning from Gloucestershire until Friday. She sends her apologies about missing the children's charity event tomorrow." Charles nodded slowly, though disappointment weighed heavily in his chest. The children's charity had been one of Camilla's favorite causes. Her absence would be noticed, commented upon, analyzed by the press and public alike. "Thank you, James," he said quietly. "Please confirm that I'll be attending alone." As James left, Charles allowed himself to sink deeper into his chair. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Camilla was pulling away, creating distance not just physically but emotionally. Their conversations had become perfunctory, focused on schedules and obligations rather than the easy companionship they had once shared. He thought back to their early days together, when she had been his refuge, his understanding partner who accepted the complexities of royal life. But somewhere along the way, perhaps under the pressure of public scrutiny or the weight of her new role, that easy connection had begun to fray. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had waited decades to marry Camilla, had weathered public criticism and family disapproval, had finally found a way to make their love publicly acceptable. And now, when they should have been enjoying their triumph, she seemed to be slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from William. "Dad, are you planning to attend Charlotte's school play next week? Catherine mentioned you might enjoy it." Charles smiled despite his melancholy. William's children had become bright spots in his increasingly complicated life. Their innocent joy, their unguarded affection for their grandfather, reminded him of why the monarchy mattered on a human level. He quickly typed back, "Wouldn't miss it. Please give my love to Catherine and the children." As he sent the message, Charles realized he was looking forward to seeing Catherine again. In their brief encounters since that morning in the garden, she had always seemed genuinely pleased to see him. There was no dutiful politeness, no careful calculation of proper protocol, just warmth and authentic interest in his well-being. The contrast with Camilla's increasing absence was stark and troubling. That evening, Charles dined alone in the small private dining room, picking at food that held no appeal. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each second marking time in a life that suddenly felt very lonely. His phone rang, and hope fluttered in his chest. Perhaps it was Camilla, calling to explain her absence to bridge the growing gap between them. But it was his mother's former lady-in-waiting, Margaret, calling about a memorial service. As they discussed details, Margaret mentioned seeing Camilla at a country house party over the weekend. "She seemed to be enjoying herself immensely," Margaret said. "Quite the social butterfly, your Camilla. Though I was surprised she didn't mention any royal obligations keeping her busy." After the call ended, Charles sat in the growing darkness of his dining room, processing what he had learned. Camilla wasn't hiding away due to illness or fatigue. She was actively choosing a social life that didn't include him, attending parties and gatherings while leaving him to handle their shared responsibilities alone. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Their marriage, which had survived so much external pressure, was crumbling from within. Camilla had found ways to be happy that didn't require his presence, while he remained trapped in the golden cage of duty and protocol. For the first time in years, Charles felt truly alone in his role as king. The crown that had once felt like a shared burden now seemed impossibly heavy to carry by himself. As he made his way upstairs to his empty bedroom, he found himself thinking again of Catherine's words about authenticity and grace. Perhaps, he thought with a growing sense of unease, it was time to examine what authenticity might mean for him, even if the answer proved uncomfortable. The night ahead stretched long and sleepless, filled with questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. The small assembly hall at Thomas's Battersea buzzed with the excited chatter of parents and family members gathering for the annual spring play. Charles adjusted his tie nervously, feeling oddly out of place among the casual-dressed mothers and fathers holding cameras and bouquets of flowers. He had arrived early, partly to avoid causing a disruption, and partly because he found himself genuinely eager to see Charlotte perform. His granddaughter had been practicing her lines for weeks, reciting them to him over the phone with infectious enthusiasm. "Your Majesty." Catherine appeared beside him, looking effortlessly elegant in a navy dress that somehow managed to be both appropriate for a school event and quietly regal. "Thank you so much for coming. Charlotte has been beside herself with excitement knowing you'll be here." Charles felt that familiar warmth spread through his chest at her genuine smile. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Where should I sit?" Catherine guided him to a row near the back, where they would be less conspicuous. As they settled into the small plastic chairs designed for much younger occupants, Charles became acutely aware of her presence beside him. The subtle scent of her perfume, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the natural grace with which she navigated the crowded room. "William couldn't make it?" Charles asked, though he already knew the answer. His son was in Scotland on official business. "Flying back tonight," Catherine confirmed. "He's devastated to miss it, but Charlotte understands." She said, "At least Grandpa will be there to tell Daddy how brilliant I was." The lights dimmed and Charles found himself leaning forward with anticipation as the curtain rose. Charlotte appeared in the third scene, dressed as a brave little mouse who had to save her village from a terrible storm. Her clear voice carried across the small hall as she delivered her lines with a confidence that made Charles's heart swell with pride. "She's remarkable," he whispered to Catherine, who was recording everything on her phone while simultaneously taking photos. "She gets it from her father," Catherine whispered back, but her eyes were shining with maternal pride. That natural comfort on stage, that ability to command attention. As they watched Charlotte navigate her scenes with poise beyond her years, Charles found himself stealing glances at Catherine. The way she lit up during her daughter's performance, the unconscious way she clutched his arm during the dramatic moments, the tears that gathered in her eyes during Charlotte's final monologue about courage and kindness. There was something so genuine, so unguarded about Catherine in this moment that it took Charles's breath away. This was a mother watching her child, not a future queen performing her role. The authenticity he had sensed during their garden conversation was on full display, and it was both beautiful and heartbreaking. When Charlotte took her bow, she spotted Charles in the audience and gave him a special wave that was definitely not part of the script. The other parents chuckled and Charles waved back, feeling more relaxed and happy than he had in months. After the performance, they made their way backstage to congratulate Charlotte, who launched herself into Charles's arms with complete abandon. "Did you see me, Grandpa? Did you see how brave I was?" "You were absolutely magnificent," Charles said, lifting her up and spinning her around despite the formal setting. "I'm so proud of you." Catherine watched the interaction with soft eyes and Charles caught her expression over Charlotte's head. There was something tender in her gaze, something that suggested she understood how much this simple grandfather-granddaughter moment meant to him. "Shall we go for ice cream to celebrate?" Catherine suggested. "There's a lovely place just around the corner." Charles hesitated. He should return to his duties, to the stack of papers waiting on his desk, to the empty palace where Camilla might or might not be when he arrived home. But Charlotte was tugging on his hand and Catherine was looking at him with that open, welcoming expression that made everything else seem less important. "I'd love to," he heard himself say. The ice cream shop was small and crowded, full of other families from the school celebrating their children's performances. Charles found himself squeezed into a corner booth with Charlotte chattering excitedly about her favorite scenes, while Catherine patiently helped George choose between chocolate and vanilla. For a moment, sitting there with melted ice cream on his sleeve and Charlotte's sticky hand in his, Charles felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete contentment. This wasn't duty or obligation. This was simply being with people who genuinely enjoyed his company, who saw him as more than just a title or a role to be filled. Catherine caught his eye across the small table and smiled. A real smile that reached her eyes and made something flutter dangerously in his chest. In that smile he saw understanding, companionship, and something else that he didn't dare name. "Thank you," he said quietly, meaning so much more than just the ice cream. "Thank you for being here," she replied, and he knew she understood exactly what he meant. As they prepared to leave, Charlotte announced that she wanted to walk between her mother and grandfather, holding both their hands. As they strolled down the London street, looking for all the world like any other family enjoying an afternoon together, Charles felt a dangerous shift in his heart. This felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in months. Walking beside Catherine, listening to her laugh at Charlotte's stories, feeling like part of a real family rather than a royal obligation, awakened something in him that he knew he should push down and ignore. But as Catherine squeezed his arm goodbye outside the school, as Charlotte hugged him one more time as he drove back to his empty palace, Charles found himself unable to forget the warmth of that afternoon, or the growing realization that he was beginning to feel things for his daughter-in-law that went far beyond familial affection. The state dinner had been a success by all official measures. The visiting dignitaries seemed pleased, the press coverage was positive, and the diplomatic objectives had been met. But as Charles stood in his private apartments afterward, loosening his white tie, he felt only emptiness. Camilla had attended finally, after a week of uncertainty about her participation. But her presence had felt hollow, performed rather than genuine. She had smiled at the right moments, made appropriate conversation, and fulfilled her role perfectly. Yet Charles had felt more alone with her beside him than he had during the weeks of her absence. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, expecting his valet. Instead, Catherine appeared in the doorway, still wearing her elegant evening gown but with her hair now loose around her shoulders. She looked uncertain, almost shy. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said. "I wanted to thank you for including me tonight. I know it was supposed to be just senior royals, but having me there meant a great deal." Charles gestured for her to enter, suddenly very aware that they were alone in his private space late at night. "You belong at these events, Catherine. You handled yourself beautifully." She moved further into the room, and Charles noticed she seemed troubled about something. Her usual composure was slightly frayed around the edges. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his protective instincts immediately engaged. Catherine hesitated, then sat down in one of the chairs near the fireplace. "May I speak freely?" "Always," Charles said, settling into the chair across from her, though every instinct told him this conversation was venturing into dangerous territory. "I'm worried about you," she said simply. "Tonight, watching you during dinner, you seemed so isolated. Even with a room full of people, even with Camilla beside you, you looked terribly alone." Her directness surprised him. Members of the royal family, even close ones, rarely acknowledged such personal observations aloud. But Catherine had always been different, more willing to speak authentic truths than comfortable lies. "The crown can be isolating," Charles said carefully. "It comes with the territory." "But it doesn't have to be," Catherine replied, leaning forward slightly. "I've watched you with the children, seen how you light up when you're genuinely connecting with people. You have so much warmth to give, but it seems like you're holding yourself back from receiving any in return." Charles felt something dangerous unfurling in his chest. The combination of her insight, her genuine concern, and the intimate setting was creating an atmosphere charged with unspoken possibilities. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice softer than it should have been. "Are you happy, Catherine? Truly happy?" She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her hands. When she finally met his eyes again, there was a vulnerability there that made his breath catch. "I'm grateful," she said. "I love William, I adore the children, I believe in what we're doing. But sometimes I wonder if I'm living my life or just playing a role that was written for me." "The role suits you," Charles said, and immediately regretted the words because they came out with too much intensity, too much meaning behind them. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, and he saw the moment she registered the shift in his tone. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken awareness. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, But there was no reproach in her voice, only recognition of the dangerous ground they were approaching. "Charles," he corrected softly. "When we're alone like this, just call me Charles." The use of his first name seemed to break down another barrier between them. Catherine stood suddenly, pacing to the window that overlooked the gardens where they had first really talked. "This is complicated," she said, her back to him. Charles rose and moved closer, not close enough to touch but near enough that he could smell her perfume again, could see the tension in her shoulders. "More complicated than you know," he agreed. "Camilla and I, we're not. Things between us aren't what they appear to be." Catherine turned to face him, and he saw understanding dawning in her expression. "How long has it been difficult?" "Months," Charles admitted. "Maybe longer." She's pulling away, finding reasons to be anywhere but here. I think she regrets accepting the role of queen consort. The scrutiny, the pressure, it's not what she wanted after all these years of waiting. "And you're left handling everything alone," Catherine said, her voice full of sympathy that made his heart ache. "Not everything," Charles said, looking directly into her eyes. "These conversations with you, they're the most honest I've had in months. You see me, not just the crown or the duties or the expectations. You see the person underneath." "Charles," Catherine whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like both a prayer and a warning. They stood there in the flickering firelight, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Charles could see in her eyes that she felt it too, this dangerous pull, this connection that was far more than familial. "I should go," Catherine said, but she didn't move. "You should," Charles agreed, but he stepped closer instead of backing away. For a moment that lasted an eternity, they stood there on the precipice of a choice that would change everything. Charles could see the conflict in her eyes, the same battle he was fighting between duty and desire, between what was right and what felt inevitable. Finally, Catherine stepped back, breaking the spell. "Good night, Charles," she said softly. "Good night." "Catherine," he replied, and watched her leave, knowing that something fundamental had shifted between them. As he stood alone in his apartments, Charles realized he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He was no longer simply fond of his daughter-in-law, or grateful for her understanding. He was falling for her, and the terrifying thing was that he was beginning to suspect she might be falling for him too. The confrontation Charles had been dreading finally came on a gray Tuesday morning in early April. Camilla had returned from another extended stay in Gloucestershire, looking refreshed and somehow younger, as if the time away from royal duties had restored something in her that proximity to the crown had been slowly draining away. She found him in his study, reviewing briefing papers for the upcoming Commonwealth meeting. For a moment she stood in the doorway watching him, and Charles felt a flicker of hope that perhaps they could recapture some of their old ease with each other. "We need to talk," Camilla said, closing the door behind her with a finality that immediately put Charles on alert. "Of course," Charles replied, setting aside his papers and giving her his full attention. "How was your time away?" "Wonderful," Camilla said, and the genuine happiness in her voice cut through him like a blade. "That's what I want to discuss." She settled into the chair across from his desk, not the comfortable arrangement near the fireplace where they used to have their private conversations, but the formal positioning that suggested this was business rather than intimacy. "Charles, I've been doing a great deal of thinking," she began, her voice steady and determined, "about us, about this role, about what we both really want from the years we have left." Charles felt his stomach clench with anticipation of words he didn't want to hear. "I love you," Camilla continued. "I will always love you, but I don't love this life. I thought I could adapt, thought that finally being together publicly would be enough to make all the rest bearable. But it isn't." "Camilla, please," Charles started, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish," she said gently. "I'm suffocating here, Charles. Every day is scheduled. Every word is analyzed, every smile is photographed and judged. I feel like I'm disappearing, becoming just another piece of royal furniture arranged for public display." Charles wanted to argue, to find words that would convince her to stay, to fight for their relationship. But looking at her now, seeing the relief in her posture at finally speaking her truth, he realized he had known this moment was coming for months. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. "I want to step back," Camilla said. "Not from you, not from our marriage, but from the public role. I want to return to being just Camilla Parker Bowles who happens to be married to the king." rather than queen consort who's supposed to be a symbol of something I never really understood. The request hung between them like a death sentence. Charles understood immediately what she was really asking for. Freedom from the very life he was bound to live until his last breath. "You know I can't give you that," Charles said. "Not completely. The role of queen consort isn't something you can simply step away from while remaining married to the monarch." "I know," Camilla said sadly. "Which is why I think we need to consider a more permanent arrangement." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. She was talking about separation, possibly divorce. After all they had endured to be together, after decades of waiting and struggling and finally achieving their dream, she wanted to walk away. "There's someone else," Charles said suddenly, the realization hitting him with devastating clarity. Camilla didn't deny it immediately, which was confirmation enough. "There's someone who makes me remember who I used to be," she said carefully. "Someone who doesn't see titles or duties when he looks at me." Charles closed his eyes, feeling the last foundations of his marriage crumbling beneath him. When he opened them again, Camilla was watching him with something that looked almost like pity. "You feel it too," she said softly. "This distance between us. We've been living like polite strangers for months, Charles. We both deserve better than that." "What do you want me to do?" Charles asked, his voice hoarse with emotions he was struggling to contain. "I want you to let me go," Camilla said, quietly with dignity, in a way that doesn't damage the monarchy. "I want us both to find happiness while we still can." Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where he had first begun to notice Catherine's presence in his life in a new way. The irony was crushing. As Camilla was asking for freedom to pursue her happiness elsewhere, he was discovering feelings for someone he could never have. "There will be a scandal," Charles said. "The press, the public, they'll crucify us both. Only if we handle it badly," Camilla replied. "If we control the narrative, emphasize my desire for privacy and your respect for that choice, we can minimize the damage." Charles turned back to face his wife, seeing her clearly perhaps for the first time in months. She looked lighter already, as if simply speaking her truth had lifted a weight from her shoulders. Meanwhile, he felt crushed by the knowledge that he was about to lose the woman he had loved for decades, just as he was beginning to develop feelings for someone else he could never pursue. "I need time to process this," Charles said finally. "Of course," Camilla said, standing and moving toward the door. "But Charles, please don't drag this out hoping I'll change my mind." "I won't. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." After she left, Charles sank back into his chair, staring at the papers on his desk without seeing them. His marriage was ending. The great love story that had sustained him through decades of criticism and controversy was over. Not with drama or betrayal, but with a quiet request for freedom. And somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of children playing in the gardens, reminding him of the one person who had brought light into his increasingly dark world. The one person he could never, should never allow himself to love. The breaking point had arrived, and Charles realized that losing Camilla might not be the most painful consequence of this moment. The most painful part was recognizing that his heart was already beginning to heal in directions that could only lead to greater complications and deeper pain. 2 weeks after Camilla's devastating revelation, Charles found himself walking the gardens at dawn, unable to sleep for the third consecutive night. The announcement of their separation wouldn't be made for another month, giving them time to coordinate with the palace communications team and prepare for the inevitable media storm. But the weight of the secret, combined with his own emotional turmoil, was taking its toll. He was surprised to discover he wasn't alone in the early morning solitude. Catherine sat on their old bench wrapped in a thick cardigan, holding a steaming cup of tea and watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked as he approached, her voice soft with understanding. Charles hesitated, then sat beside her, accepting the extra cup of tea she offered from a thermos she had brought with her. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the world wake up around them. "William told me," Catherine said eventually, "about you and Camilla." "I'm so sorry, Charles." Charles nodded, not trusting his voice. The sympathy in her tone, the genuine sadness for his pain, was almost more than he could bear. After weeks of feeling completely alone with his grief, her simple acknowledgement of his loss felt like a lifeline. "She seems happier already," Charles said finally. "I can't even be angry about that." How can you be angry with someone for choosing happiness? You can be sad about it, though, Catherine said gently. You can grieve what you're losing even if you understand why it has to end. Charles looked at her, struck once again by her emotional intelligence, her ability to see straight to the heart of complex feelings. Is that what you did? When you realized you were giving up your old life to join this family? Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering his question. There were moments, she admitted, times when I missed the simplicity of being anonymous, of making choices without considering constitutional implications. But I never regretted it because I believed in what I was choosing. And Camilla stopped believing, Charles said, understanding flooding through him. I think she believed in you, Catherine corrected. But the institution, the scrutiny, the loss of privacy, it became too much. That doesn't make her weak or selfish. It makes her human. Charles felt tears threaten for the first time since Camilla had asked for her freedom. Catherine's compassionate interpretation of his wife's choice was exactly what he needed to hear, but couldn't have given himself. What happens now? Catherine asked gently. We announce the separation next month. Amicable, mutual decision, respect for privacy, all the usual phrases, Charles said wearily. And then I continue alone. You're not alone, Catherine said, turning to face him fully. You have William, you have the children, you have people who care about you. Do I have you? Charles asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them had been willing to acknowledge directly. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, and Charles saw the exact moment she understood what he was really asking. Charles, she said softly, a warning and a plea wrapped together. I know it's impossible, Charles said quickly. I know it's wrong and complicated and could destroy everything we both care about. But these past months, talking with you, sharing these moments, it's been the only thing keeping me sane. Catherine stood abruptly, pacing a few steps away before turning back to face him. You're grieving, she said. You're lonely and hurt and looking for connection. But I'm not the answer to that loneliness. Aren't you? Charles asked, standing as well. Because when I'm with you, I don't feel like I'm performing a role. I feel like myself. And I think you feel the same way. Catherine's face went pale, and Charles knew his words had hit their mark. She did feel the same pull, the same dangerous connection that had been growing between them. I'm married to your son, she said desperately. I love William. I have a family with him. I know, Charles said, moving closer despite every rational thought telling him to step away. I know all of that. And I would never ask you to choose differently, but that doesn't change what I feel for you. Don't say that, Catherine whispered, but she didn't move away when he reached up to touch her face gently. I love you, Charles said simply, not as a daughter-in-law, not as William's wife, but as the woman who sees me clearly and accepts what she sees. I love your strength, your grace, your honesty. I love the way you make me want to be a better man, a better king. Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks, and Charles caught them with his thumb. This can't happen, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. It doesn't have to happen, Charles agreed. But it exists between us whether we acknowledge it or not. At least now it's honest. For a moment they stood there in the growing daylight, the truth finally spoken between them. Charles could see the conflict in Catherine's eyes. The battle between duty and desire, between love for her family and this unexpected, overwhelming connection with him. I need time, Catherine said finally. I need to think about what this means. Take all the time you need, Charles said, though it physically hurt to step back from her. I'm not going anywhere. As Catherine gathered her things and prepared to leave, she paused and looked back at him. Charles, whatever happens, whatever we decide, I need you to know that these feelings, this connection, it's real for me too. And that terrifies me more than anything else in my life. After she left, Charles remained in the garden as the sun climbed higher, and the sounds of the awakening palace grew louder around him. He had lost his wife and confessed his love for a woman he could never have, all in the span of 2 weeks. But for the first time since Camilla had asked for her freedom, Charles felt something other than despair. Catherine loved him too. The knowledge was dangerous and impossible and could destroy everything they both held dear. But it was also beautiful and real and more powerful than anything Charles had felt in years. As he finally made his way back to the palace to face another day of royal duties, he carried with him the memory of tears on Catherine's cheeks and the whispered admission that she felt it too. 6 months had passed since the public announcement of Charles and Camilla's separation. The media storm had been intense but brief, with most coverage focusing on their mutual respect and continued friendship. Camilla had retreated to a quiet life in the countryside, occasionally appearing at charity events but notably absent from all royal functions. Her absence had become as natural as breathing, though Charles still sometimes turned to speak to her before remembering she was no longer there. The autumn morning found Charles in his study, reviewing plans for the upcoming Christmas celebrations at Sandringham. It would be his first Christmas as a divorced monarch in modern royal history, and the symbolism wasn't lost on him. Yet as he read through the proposed guest list and activities, he found himself looking forward to the holiday season in a way he hadn't in years. William and Catherine would be there with the children, of course. That simple fact had become the bright spot around which all his other plans revolved. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting his secretary with the morning's correspondence. Instead, Catherine appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain and beautiful in a way that still made his breath catch after all these months. They had seen each other regularly since their conversation in the garden, but always in the company of others, always maintaining the careful boundaries that protected them both from crossing lines they couldn't uncross. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. "Never," Charles said, rising from his desk. "Is everything all right?" Catherine moved further into the room, and Charles noticed she was carrying a small wrapped package. "I wanted to give you this before Christmas gets too chaotic," she said, holding out the gift. Charles accepted the package with surprise. "Catherine, you didn't need to open it," she said softly, and something in her voice made him look at her more carefully. Inside the wrapping was a leather-bound book of poetry, worn and clearly well-loved. Charles opened it to find handwritten notes in the margins, thoughts and reflections in Catherine's neat handwriting. "It was my father's," Catherine explained. "He gave it to me when I was 18. Said it would help me understand that feelings don't always fit into neat categories. That love can be complicated and still be beautiful." Charles ran his fingers over the inscription on the first page. "For Catherine, who has the courage to feel deeply. Love, Dad." "I can't accept this," Charles said, though he was clutching the book like a lifeline. "It's too precious." "I want you to have it," Catherine said, moving closer until she was standing directly in front of him. "Because I've been thinking about what you said, about honest feelings and impossible situations." Charles looked up from the book to find Catherine watching him with an expression he had never seen before. There was decision in her eyes, resolution mixed with something that looked almost like peace. "Catherine," he said carefully, sensing they were approaching another precipice. "I love William," she said firmly. "I love my children. I believe in our family and our future together. That will never change." Charles nodded, feeling his heart begin to break even as he appreciated her honesty. "But I also love you," Catherine continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her words. "Not in spite of loving William, not instead of loving him, but alongside it. And I've come to realize that pretending otherwise isn't protecting anyone. It's just making us both miserable." Charles set the book aside carefully as if it were made of spun glass. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that love isn't always simple or convenient or socially acceptable," Catherine said. "Sometimes it just exists and we have to decide what to do with that reality." "And what do you want to do with it?" Charles asked, hardly daring to breathe. Catherine reached up and touched his face, the same gentle gesture he had made in the garden months ago. "I want to stop pretending it doesn't exist. I want to acknowledge that you've become one of the most important people in my life. I want to find a way to honor what we feel without destroying what we both value." Charles leaned into her touch, closing his eyes and allowing himself to feel the full weight of her words. "How?" he whispered. "I don't know yet," Catherine admitted. "But I know that pushing you away, pretending we're just polite relatives, it's killing something beautiful that doesn't deserve to die." Charles opened his eyes to find her watching him with such tenderness that it took his breath away. "And William?" "William loves you," Catherine said simply. "He wants you to be happy. He sees how much lighter you've been these past months, how much more yourself you are when we're all together. I think in his way he already understands." "Catherine," Charles said, covering her hand with his own, "if we do this, if we acknowledge what's between us, there's no going back. We'll be walking a tightrope for the rest of our lives." "I know," she said, But the alternative is living a lie, and I can't do that anymore. Not when what we feel is so real and so rare. Charles pulled her hand away from his face, but only so he could bring it to his lips and press a gentle kiss to her palm. It was the first time he had allowed himself to touch her with intentional affection, and the simple contact sent electricity through both of them. "I love you too," he said against her skin. "More than I should, more than is wise, but completely and honestly." Catherine smiled, and Charles realized it was the first completely unguarded smile she had given him since that day in the garden. "So what happens now?" "Now we figure out how to build something beautiful in the shadows," Charles said. "Something that honors what we feel without betraying what we owe to others. A love that exists in stolen moments and shared glances," Catherine said, understanding immediately. "A connection that makes us both better at loving the people we're supposed to love." Charles nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. Loving Catherine didn't diminish his care for William, or his commitment to being the best grandfather possible to her children. If anything, it made him more present, more genuine in all his relationships. As Catherine prepared to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at him. "The poetry book," she said. "Read the poem on page 47. My father marked it as his favorite." After she left, Charles immediately turned to the designated page. The poem was about forbidden love, about finding beauty in impossible circumstances, about the way some connections transcend conventional boundaries. In the margin, Catherine's father had written, "Love that must be hidden is not less love. Sometimes it is more." Charles closed the book and held it against his chest, understanding that he and Catherine had just crossed a line that would change everything. They had chosen truth over safety, authentic connection over proper distance. As Camilla faded further into the background of his life, choosing happiness in simpler circumstances, Catherine stepped forward into the light that fell across his heart. It was a dangerous light, complicated and requiring careful navigation, but it was real and warm and worth every risk they would have to take to protect it. The shadows would keep their secret, but in those shadows something beautiful would grow, something that would sustain them both through the complexities of their impossible but undeniable love.